some kind of an installation that could help generally maybe deal with some of the open office spaces we all have and we all work on and stuff. And we actually had a specific need in Boston that was exactly the same kind of thing. So we thought, okay, we could use that as the kind of starting point, the seed for it, but with an eye towards applicability more broadly to other offices. And so Trygve has really started out for the first week documenting kind of precedents and identifying different examples of interesting projects that might challenge people's conceptions of ways of dividing space or sound and all these kind of things we deal with in offices. And then so we've taken sort of a systematic approach at identifying precedents, identifying systems, materials, and issues we want. So for the first week, like I said, there's nothing really too specific towards this. Is more of an eye towards kind of starting the conversation and documenting something that could go on the Pulse webpage, definitely, and could be shared with other people in the other offices, again, to kind of start the dialogue. So the point is not to jump ahead to proposing anything, but just sort of lay the groundwork for a discussion and identifying issues and possibilities and things. So so our specific starting point here was that we have our kitchen area, which is open to the rest of the office. We tried building a green wall there. Everything died. So with that experiment done, our director said, okay, well, we still need to come up with kind of a separator here out of this. And so if you want to start the other together so far.
Oops. I'm sorry, the sound was cutting out there. Was that directed to me?
Yep. Yeah, if you want to start.
Carry on? Yeah, sure.
Document.
Okay. So the image here is of that kitchen area. So on the left is the open kitchen. On the right is just the continuation of the open office, and particularly around lunchtime, people who are still working at their desks have a noisy environment. So that's kind of where the white tables are. There is where this installation might go. So these are kind of, I guess, some of the main issues that we were coming into this thinking about. On the left, certainly the main goal is to create this system for the open workplace. And so primarily a divider that can divide space, possibly absorb or reflect sound, and thus increase privacy, reduce distractions in the open plan office space. One of the main questions for us, I think, going into this was the how it's anchored, how it's installed in the space. And so we think that's probably either freestanding or hanging, and there are pluses and minuses with each of those, and each of the precedents that we found, I think, tells us a little bit more about the possibilities of each one of those categories. And then a whole slew of other things that it could do in addition to, or kind of in tandem with, this separation of office and public space. And all of these come up in relation to a specific precedent that we'll look at. So we'll get to those in a second. So just real rough thinking about the different possible plans. So in each of these, the bottom is the kitchen. I don't know, can you see a mouse? It looks like you can see a mouse. So there's the kitchen area. And then these are those tables that we can move around. These are flexible. And then this is the open plan office. So just thinking about a few different typologies, and probably we'd end up combining some of these. Like, for instance, it could thicken, but it could also be variably porous. And maybe in the thinner parts, it's more porous. So these are just kind of a starting point for that.
Yeah, and I think the idea is to start and say, the obvious things, the kind of top center one, which is it's a wall, it's planar, and it's vertical. When you start thinking, well, it could be volumetric, you could be inside of it, could create another space altogether. And it's, again, just trying to identify other possibilities beyond what, the most obvious stuff.
Yep. So then, just a slew of precedents here that start to probe some of the possibilities. We took a lot of the work from the Borlek brothers. They do some really interesting stuff. This one in particular is an installation for a textile company that displays the company's product. But it's just a hanging screen with identical tiles that interlock with each other. And clearly the fabric would do a lot for sound absorption. So we were, and dividing space, of course. So feel free to stop me, but I'll just kind of go through quickly and identify the points of interest on each one as we were thinking about the wall. Another Borlek project, clouds, fairly similar idea, but I think the interesting thing here is that still with a one module, all of the modules are identical. By the way that you fold it and attach it to its neighbors, it creates a very different geometry in the wall. So visually interesting, as well as the properties that the previous one had. Another Borlek, you might have seen this one, little snapping plastic pieces that snap together, so you can easily reconfigure, add density, and thus, control the level of porosity of the wall. Also hanging. We are not interested for the plants. We're not going to try the plants again, but just in terms of a system which creates in this case, very porous wall, a sort of a framework. This one is also hanging and made of fiberglass hoops or fiberglass rods, which are woven together. A couple here that relate to a bookshelf. At the top, the Union project, the bookshelf cubicles stack together and can create a variable wall, but then the yellow caps protect the bookshelf, but then when they remove, function as seats and tables, and can hook together to create larger structures.
Here's the thing, we can go, typically have to go 18 inches in the center.
Sorry, is that part of our conversation?
I don't know.
Okay. I was just thrown. And then on the bottom, just I think pretty much precisely what it looks like, stretching felt hanging bookshelf, which I think is interesting, not for itself explicitly, but the idea that the wall might be dynamically flexible, so you can increase or decrease porosity and the degree to which it divides space based on the time of day or what's happening on either side of it.
Yeah, I think this one, along with the first examples, is also that it's something that's kind of flexible and could be reconfigured, and it's also a little imprecise and kind of interesting because it can be a little floppy and irregular and not so like you construct a really discrete surface and then build it. It's kind of takes the form that gravity allows it to take.
Sure. Yeah, I think there are several good examples of that in here, which are, something that is sloppy but doesn't look unpolished because of the way it's constructed, but allows that flexibility. This was just an example of a wall or partition divider which also displays objects. So one function that we thought the wall might have would be to be a sort of display space for a pinup board for drawings, or display for models, mock-ups, or sketch models. And I think this one does that pretty well while still maintaining its character and kind of a continuity of surface. This is felt as well. This one starts several projects which use common everyday materials, cheap materials, and reusable materials. So this one, when they disassemble it, it can just be used as boxes and office clips. So I think one of the threads in here, one of the thoughts that we had, was to think about the material, either think about its lifespan and where it came from before, or use a material in particular which can be reused or is has a past use. So here's along the same trends, Tara Donovan has a whole slew of these sorts of projects which use common everyday materials and represent them. On the left top, styrofoam cups, just a lot of styrofoam cups, and on the right, drinking straws, which are stacked together and glued together to create an object with a very different aesthetic from the individual piece. And then on the bottom, plastic pavement blocks used vertically instead of horizontally to create a slightly porous wall, and presumably pretty inexpensive wall. This one is probably familiar, Greglin's blob wall. This starts to think about the process that goes into the module or the item, if there is a module to the wall, how we get variability from that module. So here, all of the modules are identical. They're cast plastic, and then a 6-axis CNC robot is used to cut the holes that allow for intersections. We probably won't use a robot, but it starts to think about that process and how we achieve variability. Here's another one that achieves variability even with identical modules. So and I guess another interesting thing about this one is that it's created by visitors, people passing by. So people take these pink tiles and hook them together like Legos or Connects, and then attach their sculpture to the rest of the wall, and it slowly grows based on what people passing by want to add to it, and obviously creates a high degree of variability with a very simple initial starting piece. A couple projects from the Very Many, Mark Fornes. These both, I think, start to use a single piece that becomes dissolved as it aggregates into a larger structure. So the individual kind of pronged shape in here starts to disappear as it copies itself across the structure, and each one is slightly different. So I think there's a couple different threads here. One where the modules are all identical and then you aggregate them in different ways to create variability, and one where each module is slightly different. So in this case, each module has to be labeled because it is slightly different, and then allows the structure to achieve that variability. This one's the same way. This is created out of tiny strips of aluminum that are riveted together. So each strip is slightly unique, which allows the structure to have this variability, irregularity. Here's one with mostly identical pieces. So there's 4 or 5 different types of pieces with 3, 4, 5, or 6 prongs to them, and then those are aggregated in different patterns to create a larger structure. And this, I guess, maybe is interesting because of the connections. So the connections are very simple, just a bolt and a nut, and that allowed it to be, the whole thing was put up in 6 hours and taken down in probably less time. So I think one question running through here is how the units aggregate and what that allows us to do. Can it be reconfigured, and is it easy to install, possibly by people who didn't design it? Another Borlak, a furniture line, which I think is interesting because it takes a different approach to the visibility of the structure, in that the structure is not visible and that it's highlighting this skin or bounding box of the structure instead of the structural pieces themselves. Seems like an approach that we could take if we wanted to. The last Borlak This was, I think I put this in here because I was thinking about ways to use fabric, because it seemed like an interesting material in the pursuit of finding a wall creating a wall which absorbs sound. And so a couple of these, this previous one and this one, create something structural out of fabric, in this case by wrapping the fabric over an interior structure, in this case by laminating the fabric onto cardboard, which provides the structure for the piece. And then I guess this is thinking, among other things, about a different way to anchor the object. So this achieves stability through, well, the width of its base, but also the curving in plan of its base. So if you think back to those first plan sketches, the ones that curve are more interesting maybe, but they also introduce some level of structural stability because it prevents the wall from tipping, which I think is going to be possibly an issue for us. So those are the precedents that we gathered. And then just some ideas that came along the way. I have to admit I hadn't seen the website yet, so this was kind of independent of the comments about the Connect and the lighting up. So some of this might be behind where the discussion is, I'm not sure, but we were interested in it lighting up and then adapting to its surroundings or providing information. So just a couple ideas of how it might light up LEDs or fiber optics that could maybe be behind fabric or some material which would give a more diffuse lighting to the structure. And then these are some examples of installations we found which have some level of interactivity. So top left is just essentially a paperweight that goes on the desk and links to data on the internet and displays it in a very minimal ambient way. So for instance, it could turn red when you have an email message, or its color could be related to stock prices or the weather, and it's not an in-your-face display, but it's kind of peripheral. You can interface with it and read it instantly whenever you want to. Top right is an installation by Big. Did someone say sorry?
Set up yet. Goodbye.
Can people still hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yes, we can hear you.
Someone was saying goodbye, like a computer voice. It was
Like
very
an
strange.
automated, yeah.
I'm not sure what was going on. Anyways, so Big did this installation which starts to track people using some sort of 3D camera on the top and then adapts the car's path. Just visually, the car doesn't move, but adapts the path to respond to those people moving around. This one is interesting. Maybe we can get the video real quick. But it actuates in some way on the inside to create this cloud, which then responds to, sorry, I'll go back just a second, responds to sound in the environment by vibrating. And then finally, a connection in the Indianapolis airport tracks people's movements and then kind of plays with their relative positions. Sort of a tic-tac-toe or a Connect 4 kind of a game that it sets up. And then finally, I think this is not something new, but we could certainly use Arduino possibly some sort of wireless connector in the wall to control all of this. And it doesn't seem like that would be too expensive. Oh, and then finally, just a random geometry idea that the units could be these tessellating or space-filling polyhedra, which would allow us some level of repeatability. So the unit could be identical, and then variability could be achieved through color or material or texture or something like that. That just came up while I was looking through precedents. Okay, so just to summarize, thinking back through all of those precedents, kind of through these certain lenses. So on the left, the open plan office partition, there's those few initial examples which very explicitly divide space and do so in different ways and in different levels of porosity. Then there's a few that present information as well as occupying space, again doing so in different ways. And then there's a few that display objects or hold objects, and I think all of these three functions or categories of functions are of interest to us as we're thinking about what our wall does. And then thinking in terms of system, to what degree is the system reconfigurable or adaptable to an individual location? So for instance, the game is incredibly adaptable, can climb up trees, wrap around benches, depending on how it's constructed, kind of like Legos. Whereas the Uni project, also adaptable, the bookshelf can reconfigure, but in a more limited way. And then is it modules, which most of these are actually, individual pieces linked together, or does it have a skin, or maybe both? And then thinking in terms of tools, I think it's been, well, one comment was that it would be nice to use some of the tools that we have access to and to show the potential of those. So I guess there's a CNC machine in the Atlanta office that could possibly cut, any number of materials, not with 6 axes, but 3 axes we can get a ways. And that's how the very many aluminum project was done. In the Boston area, we have access to a couple different laser cutting studios where we can buy time on a laser cutter and cut any number of materials again. And then we also have a 3D printer in the office, a small one, but for instance for joints or custom hardware or fastening devices, that could be a good option for those. Then thinking about the structure and how it all stays together. So some of them are hanging and rely on gravity to maintain integrity. Some are purely stacking, so the bookshelves just stack on top of each other. The blob wall is welded afterwards, but primarily is sitting one block on top of the other. Obviously the same with this paving wall. Some of them create a sort of a complicated truss system, and then some of them bind together to a degree where it becomes a monocoque structure, so the aluminum strips turn into this surface which takes the loads as a uniform or unified surface. And then finally thinking about the joints, how do the pieces lock together? Is it a sort of a snap friction sort of a connection? Are they actually bonded together with glue or heat, or is there some sort of fastener? And I think this is interesting in terms of our consideration of the lifespan of the material and what it can do afterwards. For instance, the blob wall it's going to be hard to do something with it afterwards without cutting it up or melting it down. But if you can unfasten the pieces or just take the pieces apart and then reconfigure them, then there's an easier afterlife for the materials after we're done with them. And that's essentially what the life cycle is talking about there. And then just a couple other things, safety, especially if we're using fabric, how do we make it meet code? And then the question of quality, is it okay to use styrofoam cups, for example, in the office? And it seems like if it's in the manner of Tara Donovan, then probably, but there has to be some consideration, I think, of the quality of the materials and what we can add to that quality by the way that we put them together. So that's where we are.
That's a very good overview. I'm actually very interested in the fact that looking at the life cycle of such installations and how particular elements, the same seeds of elements can be reconfigured just, by tearing it down and putting them back again. And that could be a way of looking at this particular installation as something that could tour offices. So you can do it once and, you put it there for a few months perhaps, and then you tear it down and you just ship the material and you reconfigure it in a different place for a different purpose in another office. That might be a way of us looking at the process and trying to sort of scale down the scale of installations and the costs.
I love the idea of it being kind of crowdsourced, constructed as well. So if it was taken down and shipped to a new office, it might turn into something completely different in the hands.
Yeah, I think one thing we should do actually, Trygve, is with those initial, maybe when you circle back towards the end, it's the initial diagrams you did of our specific instance in our office, is to maybe then diagram other scenarios. Another situation you might run into somewhere else. So it's like this is one permutation of it, but then you might get into another space, and rather than being more of a linear thing, it might be something that kind of closes in on itself and it's more room-like or something, and show the idea that, part of the idea is that whether it's through the computational model itself, that you take the same model and you adapt it to a different space and then produce different parts for that specific installation, or that the thing itself, the physical thing itself, can adapt to different, one set of pieces can adapt to different situations. Those are kind of two fundamental ways of looking at it, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of like the game for that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think the idea, it could be something like very completely different than most people might think of, especially if you talk to anybody in the corporate interiors groups and say, how can we divide up the space? It'd probably be, I imagine they'd have a sort of narrow range of thoughts about it. But here you could, especially if it's in our own office, you could imagine a lot of other possibilities. And I think when you get into the less expensive materials, there's the kind of quality thing, but as long as I think there's a good story along with it and it's thought through in terms of say there's some thoughtful reuse of material or some projection of the next use of that material or something, that sort of helps justify and make that kind of thing interesting instead of just inexpensive. People seem to appreciate that. So in some of these I saw, I can imagine being quite inexpensive. There might be time in designing it, the expenses in designing it and maybe putting it together, but the materials themselves could be quite, inexpensive, but do something very powerful. So maybe, Trygve, we should, post this on the Pulse page.
Yep.
And, we were talking about asking for people's ideas, quite broadly originally, but like I said, we didn't talk any really specific numbers, Josh and I, but it became apparent that the scale of a project I was considering was quite ambitious for what I'd be able to budget for. So right now we have Trygve's time for this month, and I think we can do quite a lot with that, and then maybe we see where we go. Go from there when that time is up, and then talk. We could probably be a little more focused and think about what specifically we want to either document or produce in other places that that we could then budget for. But I think we've got a pretty good, Trygve's put together a pretty good overview of defining or kind of identifying possibilities and defining objectives and constraints and considerations as a starting point. So people, once we post this, if people have thoughts, I think we could say we've taken the attitude of not jumping to a conclusion, but we've just, like I said, sort of thought, well, here's some of the possibilities. If people want to suggest others, post other precedents, I'd say. Definitely, I think we should encourage that. And if you want to talk about it with other people, people in your own office, we're trying to organize we usually have a design discussion on Mondays, which this would be a good forum to discuss this, but we aren't able to do it today. But we're going to try to get together a group of people soon to talk about it, to engage other people in the office, and kind of get their input and talk about it, and help guide the direction as we move forward.
Yeah, I think this was a great presentation, and there's a lot of great work that's being done to show the different precedents and the requirements and everything. Maybe what we can also do is we can send out like an email, firm-wide email, talking about coming from CDI, announcing the project Peacock, and pointing them to the Pulse site so people can join in on the conversation and suggestions. And I would definitely like to see this thing move faster, not faster than what it is, but we only got 4 weeks of Trygve's time, plus the collaboration from everybody. So if people can, comment, and if you're interested in certain aspect of it, you want to get more involved, definitely let Matthew and Trygve know. So you can directly contact them and get more involved.
Yeah, I think what we were talking about producing videos before too, and I think one of the ideas was, since Trygve's had the time to document this stuff, is that we document this really well so it's easily shareable, and when we get to a point of modeling, doing something in parametric with it, that that would be kind of an easy thing to do, kind of look over his shoulder and take some footage of kind of flexing the parameters of the model and making adjustments and things that could be some of that kind of video content, hopefully.
Yeah, I think this whole experience, we really wanted to be as collaborative as possible, trying to get more people involved, and it's not just one person's work, but rather it's a collaborative process. And if you have ideas and stuff, definitely chime in.
Yep.
Alrighty. Is there any other questions, suggestions? And I see we're a little bit over the time. I posted the link to the Project Peacock on the Pulse site in the chat area, so feel free to click on that and link in. And Trygve, if you can also upload the PDF to that site as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I thank everybody.
You might have to define
Thank you.
by different rooms.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.